Welcome to the Goodman Report podcast. I'm Mark Goodman, principal of Goodman Commercial, a leading force in Vancouver's real estate market. Our firm is proud to be one of the top names in rental apartment buildings, development land, and commercial investment properties. Building on over 4 decades of commitment to advocacy and education, the Goodman Report is here to dive into the world of real estate, exploring the latest trends, market drivers, and insights. And along the way, we'll also introduce you to some of the most influential and fascinating voices shaping the industry. Let's get started. Kerry Gold has been a journalist for 30 years, starting as a cub reporter at the old Vancouver Courier for a couple of years before landing a job at the Vancouver Sun. First as an entertainment columnist, and then as the newspaper's music critic, spending a lot of time backstage interviewing rock stars. After a decade at the Sun, she became a weekly columnist for the Globe and Mail's real estate section, as well as an author of several books, including Michael Bublé's memoir. She's written for The Walrus, Maclean's, The Toronto Star, BC Business, Vancouver Magazine, Variety, and many other publications. She's been writing about real estate and housing issues for the Globe for 17 years now, covering everything from the market to foreign buying to affordability and government policy. More recently, she's been writing for Toronto Stories, which is a successful newcomer to the Vancouver market. Kerry was raised in Dunbar and went to University of Victoria and Simon Fraser University. At a very young age, she started out thinking she would work in advertising, so she lived in Toronto for a couple of years. But she returned to Vancouver and became a journalist instead, which is no small feat considering how hard her profession has fought to find relevance in the digital media world. Hi, Kerry Gold. Welcome to the Goodman Report podcast. I have to say it's an honor to have you here to learn about your journey in the journalism business and covering Vancouver real estate for, I think, probably 20 years, something like that.
Yeah, coming up 20 years,
20
almost
years.
More like 18, I think.
I've been reading your column religiously and I'm excited to hear about your story today. And before we begin, I wanted to learn a little bit about you and your background, where you were born, how you got into journalism, and how you changed gears into real estate journalism.
Right. I was born in Vancouver. Grew up in Dunbar. So I am a Vancouverite. My father was even from Vancouver. So I'm second generation. And I went to SFU and UVic. I got a degree in communications. I always wanted to be a writer. And there aren't too many jobs for writers, so journalism seemed like a natural progression. But I did go to Toronto for a couple of years when I was very young, thinking I wanted to work in advertising. It was fun, but it was far too cynical an industry for me. So I got out of there and I came back to Vancouver, finished my degree, went to journalism school as well, and ended up getting a job at the Vancouver Courier, if you remember the Courier.
I do, very well.
Still around. It's not what it used to be, though. There's not a physical paper anymore.
Right.
But back in those days, it was run by 2 guys, Pete and Phil, I think their names were. It was like a family business operation. And it was a great place to cut my teeth as a cub reporter and learn all the basics of journalism, covering community news. And then after a couple of years, I got a job at the Vancouver Sun as a columnist, arts reporter. And then I quickly became the music critic. So for 10 years, maybe close to 11 years, I was the music critic at the Sun.
Oh, did you have a background in music?
Only that I went to a lot of shows. I was super into music.
Like rock concerts?
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
Alternative music and that kind of stuff.
Who
was
were
more
some of
my
your
thing.
favorite bands that you covered?
Oh, that I covered when I was the music critic?
Yeah.
Oh, gee, I covered so much. I remember seeing James Brown, Prince, everybody, Marilyn Manson, he was fun. It ranged. It was, it was everybody. Everybody who came to town, I would cover. And I'd hang out backstage and interview them either before or after the show. Lou Reed was a highlight.
Wow.
Neil Young, I met him. But Lou Reed was great because he was always mean to reporters and he was really nice to me.
It seems like such a cool, area to cover. Why would you bother moving over to real estate? You don't get backstage passes in real estate.
I know, but you might like newspapers. That was a great era. It was kind of like the end of the heyday, really. I was quite lucky because I think there were 11 of us in the entertainment department at the time. I mean, we had a classical music critic, an art critic. Newspapers don't have that anymore. I think there's probably one or two people maybe in the entertainment section. I mean, I remember standing at the back of the Commodore with like all these music critics and all these record label reps from Sony and BMG and everywhere. By the end of 10 years, they were all gone. It was like the industry was just drying up. And also, in terms of just as you get older, it gets a little harder to stay out till 2 a.m. every time. And your friends don't really want to go with you anymore. So yeah, and also the Vancouver Sun, it was, it wasn't the greatest experience. It's a hard place to work. Newsrooms are known for their toxic cultures. And, they were no exception. So I got out of there and, I was lucky. I have been doing contract work with the Globe pretty much ever since.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm curious how you would describe the Vancouver real estate market and its evolution since you started writing, or even just observing the market. I listened to a podcast. It was the Vancouver Real Estate Podcast you were on. You were a guest in 2017. And back then you referred to the market as a, quote, freak show. And you said you didn't think it was a bubble. You spoke about themes such as foreign buyers, speculation, the nonsensical price escalation were all discussed. So is Vancouver real estate on this rolling boil, getting hotter all the time? Or has it changed? Is there anything about the market that's really different than it was a decade ago?
Yes, I'd say big time difference. And so I've been doing it for 18 years. And at the beginning, there was very little really exciting to write about the real estate scene. It was it was just a totally different beast. And then it became more and more interesting because especially with the foreign buyers that were entering the market, and it was getting hotter and hotter, and everybody seemed to be super happy because their values were skyrocketing. And I think that when I was on that podcast you're mentioning, what was that then? About 9 years ago? 8 years ago?
2017, yeah,
Oh, okay.
about 8 years ago.
Yeah, it was the freak show. I mean, it was just, I remember there was a website that was devoted to Vancouver houses that looked like a shack. And they were like $3 million or something. I don't know if you remember that website, but there were people making fun of us from around the world, basically, because our real estate was out of control. It's not that now. There's no way. It's a totally different
I remember
thing.
that time, 2017, very clearly. And I took some notes down. I went back to my old Goodman reports. And the market was very frothy. It was very active. In the investment market, dollar volume was up 94% and values increased 30% from the previous year. We were so busy. We were like a walk-in clinic. We would list a property and buyers would literally come in with unconditional offers and bank drafts, and we would sell the property. Now have the opposite problem, but it was an intense time in the market.
Oh, yeah. It seemed like you could sell anything. Like there was a buyer. And everything was being snapped up. Nothing was subject to sale. It was just, it was a totally different scene than now. And as for the bubble, doesn't it have to burst to be a bubble? I mean, did that burst? I don't know. It seemed to me that it went down a bit and then the pandemic hit and everything was going gangbusters again.
Yeah.
Like I know that my own home didn't go down in value since 2016.
Yeah.
Right? So I don't know. I mean, I guess it depends how you define a bubble.
Anybody today that has purchased a building, say after 2016 or 2017, an apartment building, if they want to list their property for sale today, they'll likely not make any money. Maybe they'll lose a little bit of money.
Okay.
So there's been a pronounced shift in multifamily. And I remember there was this narrative in the media about foreign buyers causing this price escalation. But in the multifamily market, I did a survey. I think it was from the Globe and Mail, or you interviewed me a few years ago. And we did a survey of the last 200 transactions in Metro Vancouver, and only 2 were from foreign buyers, like actual foreign buyers. One was from the United States and one was from Austria. The rest were all Canadian from across the country. But I think that foreign buyer money was coming into like the luxury home market or the land market where you saw that, but not so much in multifamily. And I guess the change today is that we're not in a very strong economic time right now, and the tariffs being announced. It's scary what's going to happen. I mean, who knows what's going to happen to our local market? Business is going to slow, costs are going to go up, profit margins are going to shrink. It's a scary, uncertain time for a lot of people. I sense there was optimism going into 2025 from a tough 2024. there was certainly more activity in the market, but now, like, I don't know what's going to happen, especially in the land market. Like, prices have dropped significantly, and a lot of developers are in trouble. And when you write about it, you've been hearing about it, receiverships, court ordered sales. I mean, who knows if we've hit the bottom, but it's a scary time.
Yeah, definitely. It's different.
Over the years, you have covered a lot of big issues, namely housing affordability, urban issues, rental development, land use policies, and how all of this is affecting Vancouverites, rich and poor. I'm curious on your take on the general sentiment out in the community as it relates to development and community plans like the Broadway plan. You write a lot of articles that are more on the human interest side, like, we're being kicked out and the community is being ruined. Is that still the dominant theme when you get out talking to people, or have things changed in the past decade? Do you hear more YIMBYism and the general public understanding that we have not built enough to keep up with population growth?
Well, I guess it depends who I talk to. I mean, I do like writing stories that are about people, human interest stories. I used to go to journalism conferences, and this New York Times reporter said every great story has one great statistic. And so if you've got a human interest story with a great statistic, you've got a great story. It usually works quite well that way.
Mm-hmm.
But I always think stories need to be telling somebody else's story. Like, they draw people in, readers can connect. If it's all numbers and policies and procedures, it's really not interesting to people.
Yeah.
So when I interview people who are directly affected by the Broadway plan, a lot of them are terrified. I mean, these are people who found a way to live in Vancouver affordably, and their future is really uncertain. And that's a reality for thousands of people, because you can't redevelop a 500 block area without displacing a lot of people.
Mm-hmm.
And, the tenant protections they've brought in, I mean, they seem pretty robust, but really, have they been tested? Well, frankly, they haven't. I mean, we don't know how that's going to play out.
In Vancouver specifically.
Yeah, in Vancouver.
Yeah. There has been a few successful tenant relocations in Burnaby, for example, where the tenants were moving back at the same rents they were paying before. And they did have those top-up rents. But you're right. The lag time to get a development going is years. So we're not really sure what that experience is going to be like of being displaced and coming back, and how many of those tenants will come back.
Yes, exactly. And even right now, like, a lot of people are saying, well, don't worry, these things won't get built for many years. So, like, I interviewed Tony Hepworth recently, who's a developer.
I read that article.
Yeah, and he made the point, I don't see these things getting built for a decade or something. And that's fine. But once the sign goes up in front of your building, you're living in a state of uncertainty, aren't you? And that's really a huge stress to put people through. So I'm talking to those people. I'm also trying to talk to the landowners and developers as well, because I like to represent all sides. You got to keep balance in your stories. But there are a lot of stories about people who are terrified right now.
Yeah.
You can't redevelop an entire area that already has people living there without creating that kind of chaos. Even if you try to do it as gently as possible, I mean, it's not going to happen. You're going to have a lot of unhappy people.
When you're researching for an article, one of the things I admire about your writing is that you give everybody a voice. The tenants who are being displaced, from the builders to the bankers to the economists to the realtors, you get everybody's voice, and you weave the story, and you give everybody opportunity to give their opinion. Developers clearly are cognizant of the challenge and the human condition. In your discussions with the development community, what is their take on this? How are they dealing with the fact that tenants are living with fear and are going to be displaced? Do you feel that there is a better way for policy to be enacted to address these concerns, or have we found the best path forward to balance a city under huge pressure where there's not enough housing built, and to have a tenant relocation program that apparently is one of the strongest in North America? Is there a better way to do it?
Well, it's one of the strongest, and it's pretty pioneering, but it doesn't make sense. I mean, I think there are a lot of developers who are facing huge costs right now, whether it's from construction costs, land costs, fees. I mean, that's just another cost. And from what I'm hearing, it's making it almost impossible. I mean, even the 20% below market component is extremely difficult.
Yeah.
I mean, they're a private sector. They're making money. It's a business.
Mm-hmm.
And so I would imagine, and I've heard some developers say, that the government needs to get back into the business of providing housing for its people. The federal government got out of it in the 90s. And I think that's when everything really began to go downhill for Canadians, really. I mean, once you take away social housing that's subsidized by government or built by government, and you just leave it up to the private sector, it's no wonder it isn't working out so well, in my opinion. And I think they would agree. I mean, you're putting a big responsibility on their shoulders.
Many argue that the best path forward is to reduce the restrictions for the development community to build in an expeditious manner, reduce the taxes, let properties be built, don't micromanage the developer. They'll build what the market wants. And by virtue of doing this, you'll get more properties built, more housing built. It'll relieve the stress that currently the city is experiencing. Many tenants in these older wood frame walk-ups will have more choice, will move out, creating more space for those tenants who need that affordable older stock, and that the city should really focus on building subsidized housing and below market housing. There was recent critiques with the city of Vancouver unveiling this big plan. It's been all over the media. We commented on it, that they're going to build this monster billion-dollar project and get into building market housing. Many opine that there's a better way, that the city should actually just sell the site, let the private developers do what they do best, and focus on building below market housing. And with that additional cash, you can actually reduce that 20% below market component that the developers are having to face now. And that'll actually free up more land for redevelopment. What is your take on this situation? Do you think that the city should go ahead and compete with the development community?
I mean, they say that they're not. It's basically, I guess they're using this business model to subsidize social housing and other amenities. I mean, I think that's what their plan is. They are the largest landowner in the city, right? So they're poised to do that, I suppose. I mean, I haven't given it too much thought. I don't know how this is going to play out. I mean, they're delivering market housing in those towers.
Yeah.
So it is competing with the private sector. I guess it depends where the money goes.
When you're researching a story and a topic, you must get so many opposing voices in your ear. So you'll speak to academics, economists, consultants, architects, realtors, and everyone's chirping in your ear. I mean, it's even hard for people who are living and breathing this industry to cut through the noise. Could you just kind of walk us through your process when you're getting a story and you have people telling you the opposite things and why it's right or why it's wrong? How do you go about getting the story out? And do you ever doubt or second guess yourself because you've got all this noise? And then once you release your article, do you ever get people calling you and emailing you, saying, good on you, or you got it wrong? And what is it like launching or releasing a really big story?
Yeah. I mean, I think self-doubt and second guessing, I mean, that's part of the job. I mean, we lose a lot of sleep. You always go to bed thinking, God, did I make a mistake? Is something wrong? I mean, and that never ends. I've talked to journalists who've been doing this for longer than me, and they still do that. And the fear of being sued for libel, I mean, that's just, that's like the fear of death, right? Yeah. You just don't want to go there. But yeah, no, I hear from people. I heard from Ryan Beatty recently about a story I wrote. Yeah. He won't mind me saying that because I don't think he agreed with the take. Well, it was the people I interviewed because they call my column an opinion column, but really it's reporting. I'm talking to different people. And opposing viewpoints are actually helpful because then I can balance the story. I can have one guy saying commercial properties aren't paying their fair share of taxes. Right. Do you remember this story? Yeah. I just did it recently. And then I can have somebody saying, Paul Sullivan saying, yes, they are. That's crazy, right? So that actually works for my purposes. So I like that. When I get too many people saying the same thing, then I feel the need to go in search of a different view.
Well, what did Ryan Beatty push back at?
He didn't agree that commercial property, in his case, industrial properties aren't paying their fair share of taxes. Mm-hmm. And I said, next time I'll have to interview you then. I didn't even think of interviewing you. So, but he was very polite about it. I mean, people, and that's, in my mind, my job is to get people to ask more questions, to generate a dialogue. It's not to answer questions. Yeah. I don't have the answers. All I do is actually get other people to, if you can read my story and go, that's interesting. I wonder what this means.
You're almost not doing your job if you're not creating some type of pushback. It's a very highly charged political environment anyways, and we're dealing with multiple layers of economics. There's the human condition. There are the stories of the people. There's policy issues. There's governance issues. I mean, no one's going to agree with everything that you write. Your column comes out and, I'm sitting at my desk and be like, oh, Kerry got this right. But no, I got to call Kerry. This is not right. I got to set the record straight. And I'm like, no, I'm going to leave her alone. You have enough of that.
Yeah. And wouldn't it be boring if you agreed with everything I wrote?
Totally boring. So I just wanted to move on to another topic. You often get credit, justifiably, as one of the writers, commentators who forced government and everyone to pay attention to the effects of foreign investment in real estate. Was this your biggest scoop? And if not, what was?
That was more than a scoop. That was an era in my career. That went on for years. And it was actually the foreign buying thing. And it's strange to think about it now, but at the time, nobody was acknowledging foreign buying. And if they did, they got called xenophobic,
Right.
or they were pretty much shut down. I mean, the government, the province was saying, oh, we don't have the data. We can't prove anything. And yet, I would hear from readers, I feel like, I'm being gaslit. This doesn't make any sense. I mean, there's empty condos, there's empty homes in Shaughnessy. Something weird is going on. And it was actually an industry person in the development industry who was contacting me. And I know Ian Young at the South China Morning Post and maybe Doug Todd, because the three of us seemed to be the first to sort of start writing a lot about this topic. And he was saying, you really need to look at the price of houses in Richmond and compare it with the
incomes.
Household incomes are like $46,000 and the homes are $2 million. It doesn't make any sense. Something is wrong here. And it was that basic. And he was right. There was something very wrong. So we just started looking at the numbers and they weren't adding up. There was money coming from somewhere else. There's no way that a person whose income is that low is affording that kind of house. And it became very clear that our local incomes had become decoupled from our housing, that no longer were house prices based on local incomes, that there was an inflow of wealth. I mean, my own parents sold their home in Dunbar to people who didn't even come inside the house. They sent the nanny to go and buy it, sight unseen pretty much. Like she just stood on the sidewalk. I mean, that was weird. It wasn't like shoes off, let's go in and open closets. It became a very different city in that regard. And even though people said the foreign money was relatively low, like there weren't that many transactions, I guess they were trying to claim, all it takes is a few. And you know how comparables work. Suddenly the entire neighborhood is worth more. If somebody throws money at one house, well, then everything else comes up in price. So I think that people were very happy with that situation until they weren't, until they realized my kids can't afford to live here. And obviously a lot of locals got caught up in the speculative part of that. And they were, how it went. It was a party.
The foreign buyers and, flooding the market with money from a different country was the main driver for unaffordability? Or do you think there were other factors involved?
I do actually think it was the main driver.
Yeah. And what about today, though?
Today it's not. And that's why we're seeing something very different.
What's interesting now is that people are suggesting that the way to solve our issue is to bring back foreign investment and to bring back foreign money. And there's a change now. The pendulum is swinging where they're saying, please, invest your money in BC, invest your money in Canada. It's remarkable how things are changing and the issues that we experienced 8 or 9 years ago are different today.
It's also ironic because back then people were denying that there was any foreign money actually having an impact at all. And so if there was no impact, then what's it matter if we have a foreign buyer ban or a foreign buyer tax? It should be a moot point, like whatever, right? But evidently, it did have an impact. I mean, in the 80s, when the economy was tanking, isn't that how the government tried to fix it? By inviting foreign money in and developing the expo lands? And I mean, we've done this before. I think we should just be transparent and acknowledge this is what we're doing. We are actively seeking wealth from outside. I just came back from San Francisco, and I can't help but notice that it's such a different city, the way it's evolved. And it looks to me as if they've got high-income jobs and there's not this dependency on outside wealth to create an economy. I mean, I was looking at the skyline and there's no cranes. I mean, maybe they're not building enough. I don't know. But they do have this interesting city where you go into the Presidio and there's the old army barracks and they've converted into interesting housing and office and retail. I mean, we would never do that with, say, Jericho lands, right? Which is the same sort of thing.
Mm-hmm.
We're just going to tear it down and build towers. We tend to tear everything down and rebuild it. And it's such a huge fundamental part of our economy that I think that is what people are upset about, is that they're not seeing urban design. They're seeing the loss of too much,
Yeah.
right? Like the old buildings coming down, the things that make a city charming and have character. There's a lot in our lifetimes that we've lost.
Well, there's always been that tug of war and that theme of heritage buildings and our sense of identity and the cultural landscape of our city. And I think now the prominent voice is supply, 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 which, I've always been a proponent of. Supply is probably the most important thing that we can do to ease the pressure. And perhaps I have the privilege of sitting in the room with developers and looking at pro formas and then watching them change their spreadsheets saying, oh, the government enacted this new tax, or the entitlement process is taking an extra 6 months, or whatever the new policy changes. And I'm watching how it just changes the highest and best use not to redevelopment. And then the site's frozen and no new housing is being built. This supply theme now is being counteracted by a few prominent people in the media who are given a voice, be it the Tyee or in the Globe, or they're on Twitter, where they're saying, well, no, supply is not going to solve the issue. That's not the issue. But they're never really offering a good alternative. And I'm curious, in your opinion, what do you think would be the most important thing that we could do, be it a government change, a policy change? Are you a proponent of letting the free market just do its thing and solve the problem? Or do you think that the government should still have their oversight? And do you think that more supply won't necessarily solve our issues?
Yeah, it's a big one because, I guess the conclusion I've come to after all these years is that the government has to get back into supply. They have to create incentives to build, say, co-op housing. They even used to have programs to create affordable home ownership housing, I've heard.
Mm-hmm.
I think that was in the 70s. The 70s seems to be the heyday of government subsidized housing models. And anyway, if they could get back to that, I think that would be the solution, because I don't think the problem is lack of supply. I think it's the lack of affordable supply. There are a lot of people who can't afford the housing that's being built.
So when you speak to the development community, who I know you speak to all the time, all the big developers in the city, do they concur with this? Are they offering you any insight that perhaps you didn't think about before? Or is it the same theme throughout the entire development community? Build, 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 get out of our way, stop overtaxing us, enough with the red tape and the bureaucracy, let us do our thing and everything will be solved. Do most developers that you speak to have that type of mentality, or do any of the development business community concur with what you just said about getting back into the business and co-ops and subsidized housing?
And getting the government to step up, and because you can have the private sector do its thing, right? And build housing that people, for whatever demographic. And then you've got the government who are there for the people who can't afford that housing. I'd say it's about half and half. I'd say that a lot of developers think if we just build more supply, prices
will come down.
Yeah, that would probably be rental, though, they're talking about.
Yeah.
I'm thinking condos, not necessarily, but maybe rental. Rental there probably is what they're referring to. But then there are developers, like I interviewed a very prominent developer in New York, Jonathan Rose, who's been in the business since the 70s. And he said, I've heard that argument since the 70s, like we build more supply and prices will come down. He goes, it doesn't happen that way. And he builds a lot of housing in the Bronx, and there's always an affordable component. So he knows quite a bit about that. It's different in the States how they, but he, this has been around for a long time, this argument. I haven't seen it play out. We've built a lot of housing. Are prices coming down? Not really. I don't see it.
Well, imagine where they'd be if we hadn't been building at all.
Yeah, I know. I come back to the feds getting out of the housing business in the 90s as creating taking Little Mountain out of the picture and 700 people there. And
look what happened to Seattle. Andrei Pavlov, who's an economist at SFU, did a masterful job articulating the supply side of the equation and cited Seattle as a perfect example of what happened to rental rates when they built Like the rental rates came off. I interviewed a very prominent New York commercial broker named Bob Knackle. He's one of the top commercial brokers in Manhattan, sells all these billions of dollars in sales. And he said that during COVID, Manhattan basically shut down. It was like a ghost town. And many of the residents moved out of Manhattan, for a year or two, or they just left. It was very difficult times. And he said it was as if they artificially created supply overnight. So it was almost like a controlled experiment where all things being equal, you literally jack up supply overnight and rental rates drop by 30%. And he said there'd never been a government policy or anything that addressed rental rates by more than 10%. And rental rates dropped 30% overnight. And so he likened it to boosting up the supply overnight because all these people moved out. There was just more opportunity to find housing. And so, it's this never-ending argument. I'm certainly not an economist. I read and listen to people a lot smarter than me. I also have the privilege of being in a room with major decision makers and watching how a project that could offer housing and affordable housing just simply will not work because of a new government policy enacted. And it's challenging. It's difficult because the development community is being vilified, and they're the ones that are actually offering a service to build our parks, to build our daycares, to build our infrastructure, to offer, components in these new condo buildings that are below market, or components in these rental buildings that are below market. And we're making it almost impossible for them. These developers, in my opinion, should be applauded for having the fortitude to go through years of never-ending roadblocks and challenges. And, ever since I've been in the industry, it's been the common theme.
Yeah, they are being squeezed really hard right now. And it makes you wonder, well, if the intention is to build a huge amount of, say, rental supply, it almost seems impossible with the costs that they've got.
Yeah.
And if rents are at what, over $5 a
Well,
foot?
they've come off. Like the last few months, rental rates have really softened. So now all these developers are recalibrating now. And they're saying, actually, we can't bank on $5 per square foot in rent.
So what are they doing?
They're not building.
They're just not building.
That's right. Or they're pushing the pause button.
So see, that's a huge problem. And that comes back to policy, doesn't it?
It's a huge problem. I was in the office of a big developer yesterday who I've worked with in the past. They've got 3 sites where they've frozen their rental projects. And he said the 20% below is killing us and our pro formas don't work anymore because the rents have softened. And I said, well, are you looking for any other sites? And the CEO told me, yeah, but we need a year due diligence. I used to sell sites in 30 to 60 days, Kerry. Now they need a year. Why? Because of the uncertainty dealing with the city. They actually want to go through the full entitlement process to address the risk. For fear that a council member or a policy will change, they want to get their DP before they remove subjects.
Mm-hmm.
So there's been a profound shift. It's affecting anybody who's in the transactional-based business. Everywhere you turn to try to build housing, there's another roadblock.
Yeah.
Anyways, you live and breathe these stories. You've been writing about it and covering it, and there's so many different perspectives. If you're a tenant, and like you said, I can only imagine they found a way to live in the city in an old walk-up building in their charming neighborhood. They know people in the building. You once wrote a story about somebody who had a heart attack in this rental building where they were trying to strata title it, and how he didn't have anybody to assist him, and the tenants came and brought him to the hospital. And what you're doing is you're putting a spotlight on the human element of what's happening, the human condition, and how, where are they going to go? What are they going to do? And I get it. It's very difficult. We have opposing pressures right now. And no matter which way you turn, there's going to be pain.
That's right. We need tons of rental housing. I totally agree with that. But we also need to make sure that people living in these communities aren't displaced.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, and that is painful.
Yeah, it certainly is. Are you currently working on something in the real estate world that you think might be the next big story? What's hot right now?
No, probably not super hot. I hope it's interesting. My next story is looking at somebody who's done statistics or data on the hierarchy within apartment buildings. You might actually know something about this, how prices go higher with each floor you go.
Oh, yeah.
And how it's like exclusionary zoning, but instead of being horizontal, it becomes vertical.
Uh-huh.
And I thought, oh, that's an interesting. Whenever I find people who've done interesting work of some kind, it's always fantastic for me. I find the data-driven stories drive the most traffic.
Yeah.
People love
Oh,
those
they
data
love the
stories.
stats and the infographics. And
Oh,
well, it's kind of like a pre-sale center. If you're on the 35th floor versus the fourth floor, they fly up the balloon. Well, now it's a drone. In the old days, they'd fly up a balloon to take pictures. And
yeah.
so when you were buying your condo, they would show you what your view was. And typically the price per square foot you would pay would be a little bit more depending on the view.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah. And in our rental buildings, when we're advising a client and doing projections on rental income, we will make a distinction. Are you facing an alley? Are you facing the street? And if you're higher up, you're not going to have the bus stop in front of you. And so people presumably are going to pay more in rent.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
that makes sense. So
Yeah.
I'm sort of poking around, looking at that as a possible next story. I'm kind of just always looking a week ahead. I
Yeah.
have to file my stories almost a week ahead. So I have a bit of a disadvantage with some reporters who can file like that night.
Oh,
Because
yeah.
if, say, there's a breaking story, my only way to cover it is to, when they zig, I zag. Like I do something slightly different. If, say, there's a Statistics Canada report that comes out, I try to dig into it a little deeper and find an angle that nobody else
Because
got.
you have a 1 week lag time. Like when you call
Yes.
me and you're writing a story and you want my 2 cents, you're usually a week away.
That's right.
Whereas something hits the radar, some big news story, if it's the Daily Hive or if it's stories, which you write for,
Yeah,
they can get it up within an hour. It's incredible.
that's right. It's totally different. But I write for my editors in Toronto, so I don't write for the BC Bureau. And for some reason, that's just how they lay out the real estate section. We always do it way ahead. So that disadvantage, though, has made me have to go deeper on stuff.
But you're your own boss. You're a freelance
Yeah.
writer. So could you not, well, I guess you don't want to compete against the Globe, but, bump up your Twitter feed or have a real-time blog where you're getting your thoughts out right away.
Yeah, I've thought about doing that. It takes time,
Sure.
right?
And you do a lot of research on your articles.
Yeah.
You're not just getting it out there.
Yeah.
Do you ever find it's hard to convince the Globe editors in Toronto that something happening in Vancouver is a story, like that it's a real story where they push back?
Only if I've been doing too much on one topic. Then
I
they'll
see.
say, okay, I think we've had enough of that. But usually, no. Usually, I would say 99% of the time, they trust me. And it's partly because they don't know Vancouver or BC
Sure.
like I know.
Well,
it.
you've been doing it a long time.
Yeah.
Do you ever sense that everybody's watching what you're writing to set the tone for the next story?
It's interesting. I don't know. I mean, I guess, yeah, part of me hopes that's the case. I know that my column drives a lot of traffic from what the editors tell me. The metrics are good.
Yeah.
But, when you're on contract, actually, most people work at home now anyway. So we're all kind of in a vacuum. And I kind of tend to stay away from social media. I'm not big on it. I know I'm supposed to be more into it, but I've been attacked on social media. It's not the happiest
welcome
place.
to the club.
Isn't
Welcome
it
to the club.
exhausting? It takes up so much to the day, though, when you get into that rabbit
Oh,
hole.
yeah. But it means that you're doing something right.
I know. I know.
If you're pleasing everybody, you're not doing your job.
Yes. I don't mind people debating with me or arguing in a
Sure,
constructive
in
way.
a healthy way.
But when they get personal,
Oh, yeah.
it's like, okay, now you're just being annoying. I don't want this to take up my headspace. It's like the comments section. You never read the comments on a story. Usually they're pretty negative.
I'm guilty of going right to the comments.
Do you?
I do.
Oh, yeah. Because you're in the story.
Well, I'm in the story sometimes, and sometimes I'll have to email the editor at the Sun and be like, hey, could you just remove this guy from your comments, that they're going to egg my house or whatever.
And do they?
They do.
If it's kind of threatening, I would imagine.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
Yeah, it's a bit of an echo chamber there. And I think maybe people have too much time in their hand. And
yeah, it was a lot uglier, actually, probably when I did that other podcast, like 9 years ago or whatever it was. Things were a lot more intense. People were being pretty angry.
Angry at you?
Angry at me, angry at anybody. Like there was just a lot of anger.
Right. Well, I guess because of the foreign buyers theme and
the NIMBY versus YIMBY thing.
Right.
That was going on for quite a while. That still goes on.
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't like the name calling. I think it's not very constructive.
No, but I guess now with Trump in the media, and that's his thing, he creates a characterization for everybody and likes to name call and threaten and cajole. So maybe it's become normalized.
Yeah, actually, maybe that is the problem.
Yeah.
Maybe that's our culture now. We don't have we don't analyze things so much as just sling mud, right?
Yeah.
Maybe that's where we're at.
Also, maybe we shouldn't have to walk on eggshells and be so careful about what we say and concerned about cancel culture all the time. And, like the pendulum keeps swinging back and forth of what you can and can't say.
Yeah.
And, you've interviewed me many times over the years, and I've been interviewed by The Sun and Stories and Daily Hive and various other publications, Tyee. And one of the things I've learned is like you have to build a relationship with the reporter or the journalist. There's been a few gotcha moments, never with you. You've always been fair, whether it's on the record or off the record. You've always honored that, which I appreciate. And you can kind of let your guard down and speak freely to really get to the essence of the story. But there are reporters out there, you'll speak for 45 minutes to a reporter and they'll pick out one sentence, they'll build context around it, and they'll amplify it because they've already come into the story with an angle and you're being used as a pawn in the story. And it's very frustrating and scary for a lot of people where they don't want to be in the media. They don't want to talk. They're very concerned.
Yeah, because your words are being used against you, I suppose.
That's right.
Yeah. Unfortunately, I think this is sort of a problem with a lot of mainstream media. I think there's some agenda-driven reporting happening, not just here in Canada, but elsewhere. I'm seeing.
Are you able to tell me, would you feel comfortable saying, which publications you think have a very strong agenda where you read it and you're like, oh, it's not.
I think the New York Times.
No, really?
Yeah,
Interesting.
I've seen stuff that I read a story and I think, you only really reported one side here. And if it's something that I happen to know a lot about, I can see that it's really kind of, it's kind of irresponsible, which is kind of shocking because I've always admired them. But I think it can happen anywhere. And I don't know what that's about.
What about CBC and their reporting, whether it's local or global events? Do you see any bias there?
Oh, you want to get me into trouble? I'm sure I've seen bias. I can't think of an example, but yeah, I'm sure. Yeah, they do a pretty good job on the housing file, though. And that tends to be what I read.
Right.
I can't think of anything that
it's more global events.
Yeah, I think the global events are where they get into trouble. I know people get angry at them.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I tend to not read them for that coverage as much.
Maybe we should all cancel our social media accounts and just read readers that have journalistic integrity and get the straight goods.
Yeah, I mean, journalism is just really about common sense, and trying to be fair. And even if you don't agree with somebody, taking the time to sit down, listen to them, and representing them fairly. Just try to do that and write a balanced story as best you can. And over time, you know your stuff. I have to say, when you're starting out on a beat, you don't know who to talk to. You don't know who the experts are and who are the people who just want to be the experts or who have their own agenda, whatever. You learn that stuff. And that just takes time. There's no manual.
For sure.
So a lot of it is sort of just learning on the job.
Learning on the job, learning on the street. I wanted to ask you a little bit about the media industry in general. I've heard that the old ways of doing business, it's an extinct species now, and you're competing. Everybody's got a Twitter feed. There's an echo chamber. The paper style of reporting is diminishing. It's harder for writers and journalists to survive in this industry. Could you tell us a little bit about how generally the newspaper or journalism industry has changed over the years? Like, how is this industry making a profit? How does it work? I know the Globe and Mail has a paywall, which I've learned how to hack.
Oh, you have?
Yeah, I've learned how to hack the paywall.
That's right. I think I remember that.
There's too many different sources we're competing with. So, how has the industry changed and how are reporters and journalists surviving?
It's a really good question. I mean, the Globe and Mail does very well. A lot of newspapers aren't doing very well. I mean, since I've been in it, it's just shocking to me how much the landscape has changed. I think, though, like anything, like your business, you have to pivot. You have to just accept that everything's always in a state of change. I think in my career, it's changed more than, say, previous generations. Like for a long time, things stayed the same. And then suddenly, with the internet, everything just rapidly just morphed into something entirely different that nobody saw coming, maybe. I don't think newspapers were prepared. I don't think they pivoted fast enough. I don't think they knew how.
So Globe and Mail's business model, for example, is paper subscriptions.
Yep.
Paying for online content. You have a monthly subscription fee.
Yeah.
And advertising.
Advertising. It's the same. Yeah. And it's always been that way. But now we've got the online website component. But, it's a challenge. You know why? Because there's also social media. And I've noticed that, YouTubers and people on TikTok and Instagram, they're becoming better at what they do.
Oh, yeah.
And citizen journalists are actually stepping up, and maybe they've got legal backgrounds or economics or whatever, but they're actually filling a lot of the void. So it's becoming very niche. Everything's much more granular. But they're making livings doing what they're doing. And from what I understand, you can make quite a lucrative living if you do it right. So I think that all that's taking away from mainstream media as well. Plus, there's this general lack of trust, which, again, I think isn't helped when stories lack balance, when you do have a bit of an agenda. But yeah, it's a tough time.
We submitted an article to the Vancouver Sun, an op-ed that they published. And for the first time in a long time, the editor said, could you please provide supporting documentation for these 3 points that you made? And I'm like, wow, refreshing.
That's good.
They're actually checking.
Yeah.
Nobody else was.
Yeah.
You just say whatever you want. And if it sounded right, they'd publish it. So there's still checks and balances.
Yes. We have that. We're held to that standard.
Oh, yeah.
And if we make a mistake, we have to correct it right away. And it's hugely embarrassing.
Exactly.
And a lot of our stories are, picked up by places on the internet and used without our permission.
Spreads everywhere, Reddit and Twitter. And I wanted to pivot and ask you a few other questions. You talk to a lot of people. Who do you admire, or who are your go-to depending on the issue, if you could just off the top of your head?
All my go-tos, other than yourself? Let's see. I talk to a whole bunch of people.
You talk to Hanny Lamam of Cressy a lot on the development side.
Hanny's really good.
You speak to Michael Geller as well.
Michael Geller, Eric Carlson. I've talked to him. Daryl Simpson.
Eric Carlson's fantastic. He's got a great perspective on the market.
I love those people who just say what they want. And this is great. Daryl Simpson I talked to recently. I'll talk to Brent Sachin. Andy Yen, of course, for data, because he's our data guy.
Yeah. Ian Brackett, my colleague.
Ian Brackett. He gave me some good stuff last time. Yeah. Yeah, he likes numbers too, doesn't he?
Yeah. Well, he comes from an appraisal background. So he's very focused on the facts and looking at the numbers, not just rhetoric. And that's what makes his stuff really, really good.
Yeah. And Bob Rennie, he's good. He doesn't do as many interviews anymore. He's another person who's good at especially dealing with media. Yeah, I try to. And then there's just average people. And the academics. I talk to academics too. There's a whole bunch of them. Josh.
I often disagree with the academics.
Yeah.
Very frustrating. But we won't go there on this podcast.
I think developers sort of feel the same way, just judging from the comments at the UDI
some of it's just nonsensical. And, they got their nose in a book, but they're not living in the real world. And where I'm getting the most frustrated are from the academics.
Oh, yeah. That's interesting.
Yeah.
And it's based on what's already happened a lot of the time.
Yeah, they're not in the trenches. They're opining, they're sitting in their armchair and this is the way things should be, or this is the problem. I'm not really. But
economists kind of had that reputation too.
Yeah, sometimes they do, for sure. And it's interesting. We have well-known economists here in Vancouver and, they don't always agree with each other either. So
that's right.
Who are you believing? Who do you listen to? For example, Andrei Pavlov is a very strong proponent of supply and capitalism. And so am I. He grew up in a communist environment. My mother grew up in communist Romania. So I grew up hearing stories when Ceausescu came into power. They took away my mom's home and they put 6 families into the home. They carved up the home. And overnight, my mother and her sister, my aunt, and my grandparents were all living in one room. The government had taken away their home. They took away their business. They built wireframes for glasses, nationalized it, and destroyed the country, took over everything. So for me, growing up and hearing these stories of socialism and communism destroyed the very fabric of the country. My mom had to flee. As a Jew, it was even more difficult growing up at that time, Romania. They fled to Israel and escaped, arrived at Train Guard, and they had gold bullion. They drilled into the door frame of their home in Romania. My mother went back 40, 50 years later, and the gold was gone. Knocked on the door and said, I used to live here, and they let her in. But for me, seeing how socialism is creeping into the Canadian economy, the Canadian fabric, people don't understand how dangerous it is and how counterintuitive it is to having a healthy, balanced economy. That's why you have these economists like Andrei Pavlov or people like myself saying, hey, we're going too far here. the government needs to get smaller. We can't keep layering and taking control and dictating. It's a slippery slope. But then you have other economists who perhaps support a more socialist environment. So it's interesting. You never know who to believe.
Yeah, that's true. Everybody's got their take, right?
Everybody
But
has
again,
their
I
take.
do like it. I like
Sure.
having those different opinions. Like I say, getting people to ask more questions makes it more fun.
Who would you say is a hard to get local subject you'd like to interview the most, and why?
Who would I like to get?
Yeah.
I've never talked to Michael Ledane. I would love to
Okay.
talk to Michael Ledane because, he
Yeah.
just seems like he'd be a really interesting guy.
Well, I've sat in a few meetings with him
Yeah.
at the Polygon headquarters, and he's very quiet. He sits in the room and he has his executive staff there, and we're bringing a site to him, and he'll sit there very quiet. He'll listen, and apparently he'll make his decision on whether they're going to acquire the site. He still holds the power, is that he'll look at an aerial shot of the neighborhood. He won't look at the numbers. He's got people for that. He'll just look at an aerial shot, and you'll look at it and he'll say, okay, yeah, we should buy that.
Oh, that's interesting.
It's very interesting. I read part of his book too. I don't know if you read his.
Yeah, no, I want to read his book.
Very
I heard it's good.
interesting. Yeah. He has a very interesting story. And he went from a raging socialist to a capitalist based on his life experiences. Anyways, I have a lot of admiration for him, and his art collection is second to none. And he's a philanthropist and doing really good stuff.
Yeah.
So Michael O'Dane, anybody else?
Michael Ledane. I'd like to talk to Stanley Kwok, who's getting up there. He's in his 90s now, but I'd like to hear about the Expo lands. He's kind of so famous. I don't know. I can't think of anyone else. I mean,
usually people are probably chasing you to get their story.
It depends on the person. It depends if they've got something that they want to sell you, or if they've got even an idea they want to sell. But I think Chip Wilson would be fun to talk to again. I've talked to him once, but
unfiltered.
He's always unfiltered, I think.
Yeah, amazing. I loved his signs during the run up to the provincial election.
Oh, what signs?
He was putting up our government's a communist government, and then it would get defaced, and a week later he'd have another sign up, and it was hitting the media. It was a big thing.
That's right. I do remember that. That's funny. I think, he's the character. Yeah, the characters are great. They're always great interviews when you get those people who just don't care. I'm just going to say whatever I want.
Yeah. Have you had in your many years as a journalist any goofy errors that went to print or near misses? And have you ever been sued? Like, does the shit ever hit the fan with you?
No, God, no. I haven't been sued. I haven't been threatened, I don't think.
Wow.
But I think you'd have to make a really big error to be accused of libeling somebody. It would have to be pretty bad. Errors, thank God, knock on wood. I think mostly just, the occasional time you spell a name wrong. It's so humiliating.
It happens.
Yeah, but it shouldn't. You always kick yourself. You think, God, I should have read that one more time.
If it makes you feel better, Kerry, I put a big deal in our contract and I missed a zero.
That's a big one for a contract.
But fortunately, when you're writing purchase and sale agreements and you have a big number, say 52 million, it's written numerically 52 million, and then you actually write 52 million. So both the numeric and the written version jive. And if they don't jive, then at least there's some debate of which is the right or wrong number, and the contract's invalid.
Okay.
So I had a fail-safe, but I did once put a deal in their contract where I think I did the complete wrong number. Fortunately, I had understanding parties, but we all make mistakes.
We do. It's just some are more public than others. My mistakes are very public. And people love it when you make a mistake and they can write a letter to the editor and tell you what an idiot you are. I had a math error in one, and it was actually the realtor I interviewed who made the error, but it was on me. I should have caught the error. And it was some percentage thing that just went right by me. But every math head in the city took great joy in pointing it out. And that's when they go on Twitter or something. But it is what it is. It's like, what do you do? It's just not a good feeling.
Well, finally, my last question for you. Do you have any other ambitions? Are you currently working on any books or big projects that you like to promote?
I can't promote anything. I've got a couple of book ideas. They'd be collaborations with two people. I can't mention them because they're just ideas at this point. But they would be to do with the housing market here. One might be more on somebody's life and career. I've written those kind of books before, like Michael Bublé's. That was the big one. But yeah, I like doing biographical stuff sometimes. But those are sort of at the discussion stage right now. But yeah, nothing to promote that way. No, the real estate beat keeps me pretty busy.
Well, I'm sure there's no deficit of content at all.
No,
There's
it just
so
goes
much
on.
happening.
It keeps going on, doesn't it? Like there's always something.
Well, for me, it's just like every time a client, brings a site to us, whether it's in Coquitlam or Langley or Vancouver or in the Broadway plan or it's TOA, it's just like you got to stop. You got to figure out what the plan is and then, what is the highest and best use. In the old days, what you saw is what you got. There was an apartment building and that was it. You sold it, an apartment building. Now you got to dig in and you got to go through a complete exercise and you got to figure out, is it worth more under TOA? Is it worth more at Broadway plan? Are the frontage requirements enough? Oh, there's some ambiguity. Maybe the city will give you relaxation. Well, how long that's going to take? It's not weeks. It's not months. It's years.
Yeah.
Everything is more complicated now.
Yeah.
And every time a new policy or something new is introduced, it's a ripple effect. So there's always a lot to write about.
Yeah. And there's a lot of policies. I should make a list of them all. I was thinking that would be an interesting story. It might be too insider baseball, but all the policies that everybody has to deal with.
Well, there's a long laundry list of what the NDP introduced, which is the tax greatest hits, which has decimated the entrepreneurial spirit of BC and business people and killed any enthusiasm to take risks in this province.
Yeah, somebody was saying to me that they did a chart on how proprietary products were so falling behind so far in that compared to, say, America and American cities. It's because, if you want to make a bigger income, you enter a tax bracket where suddenly you're paying way more in taxes. So the motivation to step it up is not quite there.
Yeah.
So
things are going to change.
I hope so.
Some elections. We'll see what happens.
I hope so. Because there's two sides to the affordability problem. And we only ever talk about housing, but incomes are important, right?
Yeah.
And we need to step it up. People need proper jobs. Now that I've been to San Francisco, well, I've been there many times, but you know what I mean?
Yeah.
You can feel it. It's a different feel to that city when it's vibrant and things are happening. It's like New York,
Well, maybe when you come on this podcast 8 years from now, we'll address what we talked about today and see what's changed.
Maybe I'll do one every 8 years. I'll do a podcast to see where I'm at, how I'm doing in life.
Well, Kerry Gold, I decided to go for gold. And I got my favorite guest on the show. Thank you very much for coming on and giving us an overview of what you do and how you do it and the stories that are making the headlines for the last 2 decades. So thank you very much. It was an honor to have you on the show.
Oh, thank you, Mark.
Thanks.
Thank you for inviting me. It was really fun.
Thanks for tuning in to the Goodman Report podcast. If you enjoyed the show, be sure to follow us on your favorite podcast platform, give us a 5-star rating, and leave a review. And don't forget to sign up for our newsletter at goodmanreport.com for the latest listings, market research, statistics, and industry news. Follow us on X and Instagram at Goodman Report, on Facebook at Goodman Commercial, and on LinkedIn under my name, Mark Goodman. On behalf of the entire Goodman team, thank you for listening, and we'll catch you next time. This podcast is produced by Podfather Creative.